Good evening, boys and girls. Welcome to Story Time again. We have a very, very exciting story for you this week. Actually, we had two stories for you this week. We have two stories that are ready to go. We had the story of J. Hudson Taylor, or Hudson Taylor as they call him, the missionary, famous missionary to China. That was a story that very early in my life, not long after I got saved, really blessed my heart and affected me, almost made me want to be a missionary when I was a new Christian. And we have that story ready to go, and I wanted to do that story tonight. However, my lovely wife also wants to do the story of Mary Slessor, very famous missionary from the 1800s, just like Hudson Taylor from the 1800s. She was a missionary from Scotland who went to Africa. And so I wanted to do Hudson Taylor, and Miss Margaret wanted to do Mary Slessor, but I told her, I'm the man of this house, I make the decisions, and so tonight we're going to do Mary Slessor. And so we're going to hear the story tonight, of a wonderful story. We've gotten a blessing out of reading it, and it was one I was not really that familiar with, but what a tremendous story. So far, if you remember, we've told the story of John Paton, the missionary to the New Hebrides, and then the last story that we had was the story of T. Pham, a girl in Haiti, who the daughter of a witch doctor who got saved. And so tonight is another missionary story, but it's also a story about a young girl who grew up in Scotland. So at this time, we will begin the story of Mary Slessor, the Barefoot Missionary to Africa. And how do I turn this around? Which one? Okay. I'm sorry. Oh, that one, right? Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Mary Slessor, the Barefoot Missionary to Africa. I want to ask you, boys and girls, I'm sure you must think about it sometimes. What do you want to be when you grow up? Well, this week's story is about a girl who, from the time she was very small, wanted to do something really big for God. And she grew up in a town called Dundee in Scotland. And we found a picture of her home on the internet. This was she and her family rented an apartment in this house. It was a very poor home. As you can see, the little description there. There was no running water. There were no lights. There was no indoor toilet, and there was hardly any furniture. The children, including Mary, slept on the floor. And so our story starts in Scotland. Every night in the 1850s, a young girl named Mary Slessor sat shivering by the fireplace in her home in Dundee, Scotland. Her brothers and sisters were already asleep in another part of their small apartment. But Mary and her mother were waiting up. Every Saturday night they waited up, waiting for Mary's father to come home from work. Sometimes while they waited, Mary and her mother would knit or mend their worn-out clothes. Other times, Mary's mother would read the Bible to her, and they would just pray. But one thing was always the same every Saturday, and that was that Mr. Slessor, her father, was always going to be late. And this night was no different. Mary and her mother were sitting there in silence when suddenly the door flew open, and an angry, drunk man stumbled in. It was Mary's father. He dropped some coins onto the table and then stared blankly at Mary and her mother. This was all he had left for his family. He had spent all of his money that he'd made that week drinking alcohol. Neither Mary nor her mother were surprised. This was nothing new. They didn't cry. They didn't say anything to Mary's father. Mary only looked at him disappointed. Now they would go another week in their cold apartment without any money to pay rent, another week without any money to buy food or clothes for her brothers and sisters. Mary shivered just thinking about it. In a drunken rage, her father threw the dinner that they had carefully prepared for him. He threw it into the fire. And even though Mary had done nothing wrong, her father slapped her and threw her outside in the cold, slamming the door and locking it behind her. She began to cry as she shivered in the freezing air. "Please let me in. Papa, please let me in," Mary cried as she pounded on the door, but there was no answer. Mary curled up in the dark street outside, shivering, crying, and waiting for the sun to come up. When the morning came, Mary's father left for work. She watched him walk down the street toward the factory before she rushed inside and hugged her mother. Because Mr. Slessor continued to use his money to buy alcohol instead of buying those things that his family needed, the Slessors ended up having to sell their furniture so that they could buy food and clothing. But eventually, even that money ran out too. Mary's mother continued to pray and trust God to provide everything they needed.
When Mary was a little girl, she didn't always live her life to please God. She and her friends would sometimes get into trouble. This one time, an older lady saw Mary and her friends running around the streets. She knew they needed to know Jesus. So this sweet lady invited them into her house and told them about Jesus and God's punishment for sin. Mary soon realized that because of her sin, she deserved to be separated from God forever. And Mary right there, that day, put all her trust in Jesus as the only one who could save her from sin. Mary began to love spending time with God by reading the Bible and praying. Jesus became very real to Mary, and she loved him with all her heart. Even though Mary's life was still very difficult and she was very poor, she knew God was with her every day, even when things were hard. One very hard time came when Mary was still very, very young. Her father lost his job because he drank so much. Now there was no one to provide money for the family. Mrs. Slessor went to work at a mill, but it still wasn't enough money. And so Mrs. Slessor, she didn't want Mary and her brother to have to go to work, but they had no choice. Mary had to go to work at a factory, and so for half of the day Mary would work, and the other half of the day she would go to school. Mary was only 11 years old.
By the time Mary was 14 years old, she had to begin working full time. Imagine that, working full time to support your family at such a young age. She was getting up every morning at 5 a.m. and helping her mother with the housework, and then by 6 a.m. she had to be at the factory. And there she would work for 12 hours running a loom, which is a machine that makes fabric. And even though Mary had to work all day instead of going to school, she still loved to learn. She would prop open a book by her workstation and read every spare moment. When the bell rang at 6 p.m., Mary hurried home to help her mother cook and do more housework. And then finally she would go to bed, only to have to do it again the next morning. For a while, Mary's mother worked at the mill also, but then she had another baby and couldn't work anymore. Later, Mary's father died, and now Mary would be the only source of income for the family. Mary had one day off every week, Sunday. It was her favorite day of the week because she could get to go to church. She loved to hear the preaching, and she loved to hear the missionary reports from faraway places like China, India, Japan, and Africa.
Sometimes the missionaries themselves came to visit her church. One Sunday morning, William Anderson came to Mary's church and spoke about a place called Calabar in West Africa. Today, that area is called Nigeria. He said the tribes that lived in Calabar didn't know about Jesus, but believed in false gods and evil spirits instead. They would often go to war, hurting and killing other tribes, and they killed twin babies because the people thought twins brought bad luck. Mary and her mother often talked about and prayed for Calabar and the missionaries there. Mary wanted to go there and help others come to know Jesus, but how could she do that when she needed to work and provide for her family? There was one part of Mary's city that was very bad, and Queen Street was the worst part of all. Gangs of boys and girls would fight in the streets. Mary's church rented a little building there, and held Sunday school classes to teach the boys and girls to read and write. And Mary asked if she could be a teacher there, even though it was dangerous. Mary walked there every week and taught a Bible class for the children. Some of the boys in the neighborhood caused lots of trouble, though. They threw rocks and mud at Mary as she invited children to come to the Bible class. They even beat up the boys and girls who came to the class. Well, one night Mary was walking along Queen Street after dark. There were no street lights, and she could barely see. As Mary walked, she didn't notice a gang of boys coming toward her, and suddenly she was surrounded. There was nowhere for her to run.
One of the boys in the gang was holding a rope with a large piece of metal tied to the end of it. He lifted it above his head and began swinging it around and around and around. Mary stood still, watching as the piece of metal swung around and came closer and closer to her. "You better stop teaching that Bible class, or we'll see how brave you really are," the boy threatened. But Mary kept standing there, looking him straight in the eye. The metal swung closer and closer to her face, and suddenly she felt a sting of pain as the metal scraped across her forehead. But Mary barely blinked. She kept staring right at the boy. Suddenly, he dropped his arm and looked at Mary and said, "You're very brave. You can walk anywhere in these streets, and we won't let anyone hurt you." Mary said boldly, "Then come listen to the Bible teaching."
Sure enough, the boys came into the Bible class that day. Several of them eventually believed in Jesus too. Mary loved the children she taught in Bible class. She was thankful that God let her tell people about Jesus right there in Dundee, her home. But she never forgot about Calabar. Mary continued to read missionary magazines from her church with stories about missionaries in Calabar. And when Mary was 26 years old, she realized that God wanted her to go to Calabar as a missionary. Her sisters were old enough now to work, and they could provide for themselves and their mother. And so Mary talked to her mother about becoming a missionary. Boys and girls, what do you think Mary's mother would say? How do you think Mary's mother would feel? Well, that's right. Mary's mother was so excited. Her daughter was going to be a missionary. But not everyone was as excited as Mary's mom. People said, "It's too dangerous. You're already telling people about Jesus here in Scotland. Why do you want to go to Africa? Most missionaries die after only a few years of being in Africa."
But Mary had been dreaming her whole life of becoming a missionary, and especially a missionary to Calabar. Some people thought it was foolish. Some people tried to talk her out of going, but Mary decided to obey God. And so she began training to be a teacher, and she talked to people about what she would need to do as a missionary. Finally, the day came when Mary boarded a really big ship and headed away from Scotland. This was the day she had been waiting for since she was a little girl. She was finally going to Calabar. It was cold in Scotland the day she left, but as the ship traveled further and further south in the ocean, Mary felt the air getting warmer and warmer, until finally it was very hot. And she watched the sky go from a dreary gray in Scotland to a vibrant blue in the tropics of Africa. And finally, she saw Africa. The ship sailed along the coast for a while, and then entered one of the rivers before coming to Calabar. Along the shore, Mary saw plants and animals that she had never seen in Scotland. At that time, in the area that's now Nigeria, there were crocodiles, parrots, hippos, leopards. She had none of those things in Dundee. But as they neared their destination, Mary saw the people of Calabar for the first time. They were paddling canoes up and down the river. Everything was so new and exciting. She was finally a missionary, like she had always dreamed her whole life. After 5 weeks of sailing, the ship finally stopped at a place called Duketown. That's where Mary began her life as a missionary. The missionaries who had gone there before her had started a school in Duketown, and that's where Mary began to teach a class of boys at the school. These boys were very kind and respectful as they listened to Mary teach them every day. Mary's life in Calabar was completely different than her life in Scotland. She worked very hard to learn the language so that she could talk to people and tell them about Jesus Christ. She even learned how to travel in a canoe, and she began to dress differently. Instead of wearing the fancy clothes that people wore in Scotland, Mary began to dress like the people in Calabar. She wore simple, loose clothing and didn't wear any shoes or socks at all. When Mary first went to Calabar, she had long, curly red hair, but she cut it all off so that it would be easier to care for. Many of the people who lived near Duketown had already heard about Jesus because lots of missionaries already lived there. But occasionally, Mary traveled into the jungle with 1 or 2 other missionaries to meet the people who lived far away who had never heard about Jesus. She met so many people. She realized how many people were still needing to know about Jesus Christ for themselves.
As Mary learned more and more of the language, she would hike with other missionaries through the thick jungles and visit different villages. She learned so much about how the people lived and what they believed during these trips. In one village, another missionary, John Bailey, preached a sermon about Jesus. After he spoke, he asked Mary if she would like to say a few words. She asked him to read from John chapter 5 about the man who was healed by Jesus. Then, with the words she knew in their language, she tried to tell the people that Jesus could heal them from their sin.
Mary continued to teach at the school and help at the mission house in Duketown, but she also visited the local women in their homes, and it was here that she got to know about them and learned about their lives and their customs, and she got better and better at speaking their language. After Mary had visited more and more villages, she no longer wanted to stay in Duketown. She wanted to go live among the people who had never heard about Jesus. She was determined in her heart to travel to those villages where missionaries had never gone before, even though many people said it wasn't a good idea. It's too dangerous, they said. A woman can't travel there alone. You'll be killed. But Mary kept praying and trusting that God would guide her further into the jungle when his time was right. After 3 years in Africa, Mary became very sick with malaria and almost died, so she had to return to Scotland to get better. Many people wondered if she would ever return to Calabar, but she did. She recovered, and after some time of getting stronger in Scotland, she came back to Calabar. When she arrived in Duketown, the missionaries there told her she would not be staying there long. Mary's dream to go further into the jungle to tell people about Jesus was coming true. They were sending her further, deeper into the jungle, to a place called Old Town, and she would be the only missionary at Old Town. When Mary arrived in Old Town, the first thing she saw was a pole with bones hanging from it set up in front of the meeting house. This was definitely different than things in Duketown, but Mary knew God had sent her there for a reason. These people needed to know about Jesus. The people in that place had many evils, but one of the things that disturbed Mary the most was how people treated twin babies. They believed that twin babies brought bad luck, and if twins were born, they were killed or abandoned in the jungle, and the mother was kicked out of the village. I actually have twin sisters, and Margaret and I have twin granddaughters. So it's horrible to think that when a woman gave birth to twins, the babies would be killed and the mother would be cast out. This made Mary very sad and angry. The people did not realize that every life, no matter how small or weak, is precious to God.
One day, a baby was left on Mary's doorstep. He was crying, and no one would tell her where the baby had come from. Mary took the baby boy to live with her, and soon Mary had several more abandoned babies living with her. One day, Mary rescued her first set of twins, a boy and a girl. Unfortunately and sadly, the boy did not survive, but Mary named the girl Janie, after her youngest sister. Janie became one of Mary's daughters, and some of the other children that Mary rescued became her adopted children.
Rescuing and taking care of twin babies was a big job, but that's not all that Mary did. She traveled from village to village, helping people who were sick. She not only gave them the gospel, but she gave them medicine and prayed with them. Mary became famous among the villages in Calabar, and people even started calling her Ma, because she took care of them like a mother. Chiefs and leaders from all over Calabar would ask for Mary to come and help them when someone was sick or when there was an emergency. The people would come and plead with her to go help. They would cry, "Run, Ma, run!"
A chief in another village 30 miles away heard of Mary and wanted her to visit him. She agreed and traveled there by canoe with several of her children. While they were there, a big tornado came through. Trees and huts and canoes and roofs were flying through the air as the wind swirled and screamed around the hut where Mary and her children were staying. Mary gathered her children around her and said, "Come, let us sing to the Lord." Mary was not afraid because she knew that God was in control of everything, and her and the children started to sing together. The storm was bad, and it even blew the roof off of the hut while they were in it, but finally it passed by. Everyone was safe, but they were all soaking wet because the roof blew off. This caused Mary to come down with a fever, and it was several days before she was better. But storms didn't stop Mary from wanting to tell more people about Jesus. She knew there were more villages where the good news of Jesus had never been told. One of those villages was Okoyung. Mary determined that she would go there next. But the Okoyung people were even worse than the people in Old Town had been. Her friends begged her, "Don't go, Ma. Those people are so evil. They will hurt you, and they will hurt your children." Well, boys and girls, what do you think Mary will do? Do you think Mary will go? Do you think Mary will be safe and her children would be safe? How will the Okoyung people treat Mary? Well, boys and girls, you'll have to come back next week, and we'll hear the rest of the story of Mary Slessor, the Barefoot Missionary to Africa.
Okay. All right. Thank you, boys and girls, for being here with us tonight. And we'll finish the story next week, and we hope we'll see you then. All right. Friday night, 7 o'clock. We love you and hope we see you soon. All right. God bless you.